Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, that was a fun text to start out my return from sabbatical with. I do want to share some thoughts about the challenging words of Jesus in Matthew 5, but before I do that, I wanted to share a little bit about an experience that I had on my sabbatical. One of the things I was looking forward to most was taking a pottery class on the wheel. I took a class decades ago and had part of a day on the wheel 3 to 4 years ago and really enjoyed it. So it was a perfect opportunity, I thought, on my sabbatical to kind of get back and relearn pottery and kind of advance some of my skills. And a lot of it came back pretty quickly. Basic steps for making any piece on the wheel from clay involve first centering a clump of clay on the wheel. And you want to get it to a point where you've got your fingers and hands on it and you can't feel any wobble at all. It's just perfectly centered. And if you've never done it before, there's more to it than you might think. I mean, it's not real hard, but it takes some practice. It requires some opposing force from both sides simultaneously and force applied from the side and downward at the same time. And it's the opposing forces that help center it. And once you've done that, you need to carefully find the center of your clay and start a hole in it. And then once you've done that, then you begin to draw out the center to open it up until you have some walls. And again, when you have the walls, and if you want to draw it up, you need opposing force on the walls to help draw it up. And I learned that process years ago, and it's still remembered it, and so it was a matter of just kind of getting the feel for it again. The first piece I threw was a bowl, and bowls, I think, are probably a little easier because you're going with the outward force of the wheel more. By about week 3, I was trying to form some taller vessels like mugs, and I was getting a little frustrated, to be honest. A lot of the same principles are at work, but somehow I just found myself having trouble, and one of my pieces had collapsed, and then I was having trouble even centering my clay at some point, and I'm thinking, what happened, I know how to do this. Why is this so hard all of a sudden? And I was getting really frustrated, and I was thinking, what's the point? I mean, this was supposed to be fun and relaxing on my sabbatical. Forget this. The class period was nearing the end, and I was about ready to just clean up and be done for the day early. And just then, a classmate walked by and just started chatting with me. And he asked me what I was working on, and, I couldn't, pretend. I just said, I don't even know. I am, kind of struggling right now. And I explained what was happening, and I just felt kind of foolish admitting that I was even having trouble centering my clay in my 3rd week after I'd even done it before. And this was pretty basic stuff. And in a very kind and gentle way, he noticed that my elbows were not anchored into my body. My hands were just kind of floating without proper support. Somehow I'd forgotten it. I was a little embarrassed. But honestly, I was just grateful for his insight, and it came as welcome help. Sitting down at a wheel, like any new endeavor, can begin with joy and excitement. And at some point, you encounter the need to revisit forgotten basics, to maintain the positioning and practices and skills you've learned to create something, and then you can find the joy and the creativity in it all again. And in the words of Jesus and Paul and writers throughout Scripture, we find principles at work that I think parallel some of the same lessons I've been relearning and developing in pottery. It requires being anchored in core practices and teachings, and it takes energy applied in what may seem like countervailing directions to create something of beauty and lasting value. One of the most basic examples of that in Christian teaching is the relationship between law and gospel. Law, in more simple terms, is what you're supposed to do, what's required. It's the standards and the expectations. And one of the most positive descriptions of the reason for law can be found in Psalm 1. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path that sinners tread or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. Do these things, and life will go well for you, or at least better. Many people look to Christian faith and perhaps spirituality and religion more broadly as a guidebook for living a good life and prospering in some way, even if that's in the context of a relationship or in finding a sense of greater meaning and purpose. It's seen as a way to create a better world, perhaps. And Christian faith does offer that. Jesus does lay out a way of life and a way of looking at the world that brings life to us and others. But of course, living that life perfectly or even well on balance doesn't always pan out. Even those of us who pursue that life with our greatest effort and intentions fall short. We may end up contributing to pain in relationships in the process. Even without much awareness, we may contribute to injustices or speak words that are harmful. And sometimes we're the recipients of that ourselves. And so alongside passages like Psalm 1, you find a passage like the one I read earlier from Matthew 5. Instead of, perhaps a bit more positive, affirming description of the value of living righteously and rightly by the law, we find what many probably hear as a more critical rebuke of wrong living. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are simply angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment." Jesus is taking a pretty universally accepted law, such as don't murder, and actually raising the bar. It's not enough to simply refrain from killing someone. Even if you're filled with anger, this is wrong, he says. I mean, it's true, but wow. Is that even realistic? Can anyone avoid getting angry? That's a tall order. We all get angry. In fact, to pretend that you don't or that you can avoid anger altogether might not be so helpful. But Jesus is simply pointing out a reality of how it functions, how it can be destructive. Being angry at someone has a way of growing over time and damaging a relationship and even damaging ourselves. Verbal abuse and emotional harm can ruin a life too. It's not what God envisioned for our lives or the lives of our neighbors. It will eventually lead to pain, not only for others, but for ourselves if we don't resolve it. Jesus goes on to raise the bar across other areas of life, including oath-making and divorce and adultery. Again, Jesus is going beyond more easily achievable standards to much more challenging ones. That's interesting context. There is interesting context behind some of his words, including a debate between two rabbinical schools at the time of Jesus on the topic of divorce. One that was stricter and one that was more permissive, but actually harmed the well-being of women in that day who depended on marriage for their economic livelihood to avoid poverty. And the practices of men just sort of divorcing at will actually negatively impacted women the most. And so the way that Jesus raises the bar on adultery and divorce shines light on the husband's actions in the relationship and calls men to account. But along with these more rigorous standards, the consequences he lays out sound even more drastic and unthinkable even. In fact, the call to eliminate body parts to avoid sin should give us obvious pause, raise the question of whether this might be a form of hyperbole and metaphor, and call into question whether this kind of approach is even sustainable. It's a passage that can seem so challenging that you're left either feeling hopeless or like it's not worth listening to at all. When you are challenged beyond your capability and without support, sometimes you simply regress. You might feel like I did, sitting at the pottery wheel that day, struggling, ready to throw up my arms and say, forget about it. This is supposed to be fun. A little challenging, sure, but what's the point if it's not working? I wanted to be further along. But rather than get caught up in that for more than a few minutes, I took a breath and I embraced the humility of that moment, and I listened to the insights of a fellow classmate. In the kindest way, he wondered if I'd forgotten a fundamental practice of anchoring myself and my elbows to keep the clay centered. It was mystifying because I knew that lesson. I knew it well. I had been doing it somehow. I just forgot for a while and didn't realize it. Are there fundamentals in life that you forget sometimes? Fundamentals like the ones Jesus was teaching about in today's reading regarding anger, infidelity, staying true to your word, reconciling with people. Maybe there are others more relevant to you today. Sometimes when you realize you strayed from some fundamentals, it can humble you. Occasionally, you might feel so frustrated with yourself or others that it all feels hopeless or pointless. But that's when the other principle, the other force at the heart of Christian faith is so crucial and important. It applies a counterforce to the voice of the law that leaves us feeling like we don't measure up, like it's not working. It's the positive force of the gospel, the word that says you are loved regardless. You matter regardless. You belong regardless. And it's the gracious gift of help. The words Jesus shared in the passage from Matthew 5 sound more like law to most of our ears, but they're not the entirety of his teaching. Jesus' life and words also spoke loudly to the gift of God's love and grace, generously and abundantly offered to you and me and all, even those seemingly beyond forgiveness. This is the good news, a word of life. On one hand, if we only ever hear words of law from others or from within, words of discipline and challenge and reprimand and lecture, then we're likely just to end up in a place of frustration, despair, or simply indifference. But if we are loved, if we know we belong and matter, then we may be able to receive a word of kind instruction. On the other hand, if we're only praised, always comforted, never allowed to see areas of growth needed within, then we'll lack some creative potential as well. The Christian life has parallels to forming clay on a wheel. To create something special and useful requires what seem countervailing forces to bring balance, to draw up the structure of some new creation that will possess a kind of purpose and beauty. Both love and instruction, grace and fundamental practices. As you hear difficult passages like the one from Matthew 5, hear them as challenges to see the fundamentals of a good life more clearly, but not apart from the words of grace and good news that Jesus speaks as well. May you see yourself formed in the grace and kind instruction of the author of life. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.